If you'll turn over to Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52, we're still looking in our studies in the intertestamental period at the Jerusalem temple. And this passage in Luke chapter 2 is certainly one of the Bible's priceless, precious stories. It's become a very famous passage indeed because it provides the only glimpse of Jesus between infancy and ministry. This is contrary to a lot of the apocryphal or pseudepigraphal gospels, as they're sometimes called, that fill in the silence of the scriptural record as to just what was taking place in Jesus' life from, well, virgin birth. We know some of that since Luke gives that to us, as well as Matthew, and the beginning of his ministry about 30 years later, Luke tells us. We've got one story, however, in the canonical text of Scripture, and that is the account of Jesus going to the temple when he was 12. This is found in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Now, we've already looked at it once before because he ends up in the temple in verse 46. And we looked at Greek words for the temple words, back at the very beginning of this study of the Jerusalem temple. But now we want to come at it from another angle, and that is the angle of its occasion. The angle of its occasion. And we're going to look at quite a few particulars. I mean, we have a lot of information from 41 through 52. A large amount of information dealing with simply his trip, his parents' trip, to the temple at Jerusalem. Well, as you know, the occasion is the festival of Passover. If you don't, now you do. The occasion is the Old Testament feast of Passover. And with that in mind, let's read this passage and we'll come back and start looking at it. Now, his parents went to Jerusalem every year, verse 41, at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew it not. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. When they found him not, they turned back to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And he said unto them, How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business? And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. And he went down with them, and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. And his mother kept all these sayings in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. Priceless, precious story that the Bible has. Our only glimpse at our Lord between infancy and ministry. So we want to look at this in light of what we're studying concerning the temple. He's going up to the temple. That's a specific occasion because of the Passover festival. We want to see what we can learn about his life and the occasion here, and see how this ties in with the history that we know of the Jews and the way they traveled and the Passover feast and so forth back in the first century. Well, to begin with, if we go back to the diagram that I had up here for you earlier, I've had up here several times of the whole Temple Mount, or the temple compound. The only reason that the temple compound ever really had to be as large as it was, as we have seen in diagram, was because of the triannual invasion, so to speak, of the holy city by multitudes of Jewish pilgrims. In other words, had it not been for this triannual invasion of the holy city, just the local population of Jerusalem and the surrounding area of Judea, even reaching up into Galilee, would never have necessitated the temple compound being so large. Remember, we're talking about 35 acres of territory here. Do you really need 35 acres on a day-by-day, Sabbath-by-Sabbath basis for the people in Jerusalem? Jerusalem, Joachim Jeremias, to mention him in his writings again like I did last time, has estimated that Jerusalem had a population, I think this is his estimate, of about 120,000 people. That's fairly large for an ancient city, but nothing compared to big modern megalopolises like Mexico City or Tokyo with their 20 millions plus people. But even with 120,000, even with, assuming it's larger than that, 170,000, even with surrounding Judean population, do we really need a temple compound, a temple mount that occupies 35 acres, 300 plus by 500 plus yards? No, not really. You'd never have as many people as you would need to fill that up on any given occasion. But the threefold exception would be the triannual invasion of the Holy City by multitudes of Jewish pilgrims. In other words, on a regular, let's say day by day or even Sabbath by Sabbath basis, even people in Jerusalem wouldn't be coming to the temple. Maybe we haven't paused long enough in our study of the temple to think about that and to make sure we understand that. I mean, the temple is a great and grand and glorious place, but it's not exactly like a church where you go twice a week or 3 times or at least every Sunday morning or something. And the temple was a place of sacrifice. You got your instruction basically in other places called synagogues that we'll talk about after we finish our study of the temple. So why go to Jerusalem? If you don't have need of sacrifice, and when are the great times of sacrifice? With the 3 great annual occasions of the various feasts, tabernacles, Passover, and Pentecost. So it's only during these 3 times. So let me make some comments about this triannual invasion of the Holy City. In the first place, I know last time we were talking about the supplies of the temple, talking about some of the suppliers where the temple industry, as it were, obtained the various supplies that it needed. Well, the quantities of sacrificial animals, which would include things like bulls and rams and calves and goats and sheep and doves, needed at these times of the year would take a quantum leap over normal occasions. Especially this would be true with Passover. For instance, the Talmud has this very interesting remark, and evidently the Talmudic writer intends for us to take this literally, where he says, I'll paraphrase it in essence, that the need for calves was so great at Passover. Now, just at that time, not just on a regular Sabbath basis, but the need for calves was so great at Passover that all calves within the vicinity of Jerusalem, without exception, were destined for the altar of burnt offering. They'd take care of everyone's calf anywhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem. That'd be the city as well as the surrounding area. So says the Talmud. Again, I'll paraphrase it, that the need of calves was so great at Passover that all calves within the vicinity of Jerusalem, without exception, were destined for the altar of sacrifice. So it's during these 3 occasions, and Passover would head the list, where your need of sacrificial animals would take a quantum leap over normal, regular, Sabbath-by-Sabbath occasions. So what we're saying there is how large the temple compound would have to be, at least on these 3 occasions. And you can't dismantle it and wait till the next Passover and rebuild the temple again. If you've got it big for those 3 occasions, you might as well leave it big for all the times in between. And the times in between will by far outnumber those 3 occasions where you're going to have need of so much space. If you'll turn back to the Old Testament, Exodus 23, we'll just look at the Old Testament references for these 3 festivals. Exodus 23, verses 14 through 19. Now, I want you to remember all of this in light of the fact that we're in Luke 2. Jesus is going up as a 12-year-old at Passover time. So anything I'm saying now, then you're to try to kind of construe that in your mind. Picture him going up to the temple on this particular occasion. So Moses' law had said in Exodus 23, 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. Exodus 23 and verse 14. Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread. Of course, this is Passover here. 7 days, as I commanded thee, the time appointed the month of Abib. For in it thou camest out from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. Verse 16. The feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labors, which thou hast sown in the field, and the feast of the ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy labors out of the field. 3 times in the year all thy males. Now, here's something a little different. 3 times in the year all thy males shall appear before the Lord God. Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. The first of the first fruits of thy land thou shalt bring unto the house of the Lord thy God. So you've got from Feast of Passover in verse 15 through Tabernacles in 16 down to the Feast of Pentecost in verse 19. And then this is recorded also in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 16 and 17. 3 times, that's why we call it triannual, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose. Jerusalem has not been chosen yet at this time. It's still future tense from the point of reference of the writer of this, Moses. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, in the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. We'll say more about that verse when we get down to the offerings and so forth they had to bring. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which he hath given thee. Which would tend to imply that some in ancient Israel would be more blessed than others. Therefore, some would be able to give more than others. And I think we could go back and find something even deeper than all of that. Someone is obeying God more than someone else. And that is why they're blessed, as Moses will go on to demonstrate in the 28th chapter of this book. So here in the Pentateuch, we see that the Old Testament law had required this triannual pilgrimage. But you've got to remember we're talking about the Pentateuch here, and it envisions a local settled people. It's not thinking of Luke 2 situation after Babylonian captivity and exile and return, after Roman conquest of the world, in other words, after the diaspora. The Pentateuch envisions a local setting where all of God's people are in Israel. They're all being blessed in Israel. The Pentateuch certainly doesn't foresee the diaspora condition, which would be quite another matter. So here you've got a number of people, as we've studied with the Jewish diaspora, outside of Israel. And very few of them, if any, could make it to all 3 of these annual festivals. Some of them would pick Pentecost or Tabernacles, if one of those happened to be more convenient. For instance, in Acts chapter 2 and verse 10, we've got some people, now these aren't Pentecost pilgrims, this list, but we've got one group of Pentecost pilgrims here. They're here probably at Pentecost as a stayover from Passover. But by far the majority of the diaspora Jews who are going to be faithful and return at all would return for the feast of Passover. Now, it would be kind of like, a theological question or an historical one or situation ethics one to ask, well, what was God's attitude about it? I mean, the Pentateuch said 3 times a year shall all thy males appear before the Lord thy God, and they shall not appear empty. Well, what if they live in Corinth or in Italy? 3 times a year would be 3 times a year back to Jerusalem and back to Palestine. Well, I would think that probably what we have here, and it's just speculation because we're not given an answer. I mean, the New Testament's bursting upon the scene there, and so all those holy days and holidays have been done away with. But it's speculation that probably this would be allowed of God, since, as I just said earlier, so I conditioned my raising and answering of the question with an earlier comment, since the Pentateuch envisions a local setting. The Pentateuch doesn't envision a diaspora setting. If it had envisioned a diaspora setting, I don't know what it would have been then. I guess if it had envisioned that, with us knowing that was the vision of the Pentateuch, then whenever it said 3 times you shall appear, then indeed 3 times you shall appear. But if its outlook is a local, settled outlook in the land of Palestine, then probably it'd be up to the people to pick which of these they could come back for. I would hope that they would come back for at least one of them. And by far those that do come back, and not all do, for any of them, by the way, the majority of them that do come back do return for the Feast of Passover. But that concerns the diaspora. Let's come back to Luke 2. We're talking about in Israel now. Even those in other places of Israel outside Jerusalem, in other words, Galilee. Jesus was from Nazareth of Galilee. Did not necessarily attend all 3. There are some references, and there may even be some indications right here in our account, that people who lived in Israel but who did not live near Jerusalem simply did not make it back to attend all 3. For instance, look at Luke 2 and verse 41. Luke 2:41 mentions only the Passover. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover. It mentions Passover as though these were the only ones that Joseph and Mary attended. It didn't say now his parents went to Jerusalem on several occasions every year, and one of these was the Passover. It just says his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. That would seem to imply that they did not go back for tabernacles and Pentecost. If that's true, and these are certainly godly people and a godly couple, then that would go a little way anyway in proving that God would leave it up to them which they wanted to attend. Now we know that Jesus and his brothers attended one of the other feasts over in John chapter 7, verses 1 to 3, along with verse 10. John 7, 1 to 3, and verse 10, we see that Jesus and his physical siblings, his blood brothers, attended the Feast of Tabernacles. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. His brethren therefore said unto him, Depart hence, and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the work that thou doest. Verse 10, But when his brethren were gone up, then went he also up unto the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. Perhaps Joseph and Mary went earlier to tabernacles or Pentecost. We don't really know, but we do know that they go to Passover according to Luke 2:41. We just aren't told anything else about that. If you take the implication of Luke 2:41, maybe it means that they did. Now, of course, later we see Mary in Jerusalem at the Feast of Pentecost. Acts 1:14 and Acts 2:1. But I think other factors are involved here than going to Jerusalem to celebrate some Jewish feast. This is the day of Pentecost, the founding of the church, the coming of the Holy Spirit. So I think we have other factors involved here. She's not just going back to celebrate some Jewish feast. She's there in allegiance and obedience to her Son, who's the Lord of heaven, who said, Don't depart from Jerusalem until you be endued with power from on high. And they had all been there at Passover just before. That was his crucifixion. And so she remains. Anyway, let's come to a look at Jewish travel to the Passover in the first century, and I want you to see how interesting the parallels are that Luke gives us, how accurate and correct he is in this little small section of verses 41 through 52 and his second chapter. He's very accurate in his portrayal of Jewish travel to a festival or holy season in the first century. And I want to deal with this under three different headings. First place, we'll look at preparation for travel. Then we'll look at the actual trip. And then we'll look at their arrival. Preparation for the trip, and the end of the trip. And you'll need to kind of keep your finger in Luke 2, although we're going to be moving to some other passages as well, but we'll concentrate on Luke 2. All right, let's go back to that first verse in this section. We'll start dealing with preparation now. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover. Now we know that they live up in Nazareth in Galilee from other places in the New Testament. So in order to make a trip of about 50 or 60 miles, they're going to have to make some preparations. Now this wasn't just like, well, we'll run down there and celebrate that and get back home in a hurry. It took several days to walk down there. You've got a feast that lasts 8 days. You've got Passover, and you've got 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you have 8 days. 8 days stay, away from home. 8 days stay away from home. Then you've got several days on the way back. In other words, about a half of a month would be taken up just in going from Galilee, Nazareth, down to Jerusalem in Judea to celebrate the Feast of Passover. So in their preparation, they would want to make sure they go at the right time of the year, and it just so happens that God had worked everything out that these 3 required feasts fell during the good part of the year as far as weather was concerned. The rainy season in Israel does not end until February, March. And so no traveler would even think of moving or traveling anywhere in Israel anyway prior to that time. For instance, if you turn over in Matthew 24 and verse 20, let me just show you a little verse. I'm sure you've seen this before. I'll tell you what it means. We in the West, especially we in the West and in the North, would tend to read this verse with our own geographical setting in mind and not that of first century Israel. But the rainy season doesn't end until around what would constitute for us February and March, and I'm saying that no traveler would think of moving before that. You'd have to wait until at least the end of March, what we would count March, to begin to travel. Now here in an eschatological setting in Matthew 24 and verse 20, Jesus said, he's saying that bad times are coming, and those that are in Judea, verse 16, flee into the mountains, and let those on the housetops not come down to take anything, and woe unto those that have newborn children. And then verse 20, but pray ye that your flight be not in winter. Pray ye that your flight be not in winter. Well, not so much because of the cold and snow, which they wouldn't have, but because of the rain and muddy roads. See, we would read that from a northern United States perspective. Well, I know why you wouldn't travel in winter. You'd get in a snowdrift. Well, not in Israel. There are not too many snowdrifts. The snow only infrequently falls, and you don't really have any drifting, comparatively speaking. So it's not so much because of the cold, but because of the rain and the muddy roads. You simply wouldn't get anywhere. Now, you don't have paved roads, you have mud roads, and so you want to wait for them to dry out. So you have to wait for the dry season. So as a result, Jerusalem saw most of its tourists, including the Jewish ones, from March through September. We could say around March through September. And it just so happens that this is when those 3 feasts occur. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Well, it's not a coincidence. God arranged it that way. I mean, He's not going to arrange it so that the 3 feasts are during the worst time of the year and no one can get there. He has the 3 feasts at the right time of the year, and that's, dependent on so many other things, such as, the date of the Exodus, what time of the year they were brought out, that settled feast of Passover. Well, God had to do that. I mean, all of this has to be in conjunction in the mind of God. He's not caught by surprise by anything. He has it all planned out from the beginning. And he has these 3 feasts occurring during the right time of the year. And he had the Exodus and all these other events that dictate, for instance, the time of these feasts. He had those arranged as well, so that everything is in conjunction and put together properly in his mind. Well, one of the things they would do, if you picture like a family heading off on a vacation, you have to make plans. We're talking about preparation. One of the things they would have to do is they would have to come up with their dues, D-U-E-S. They would have to be prepared to pay their dues. The man above a certain age would have to pay a half shekel temple tax, or the tax of the didrachma, along with the didrachma seen over in Matthew 17. Quite some time ago, if you recall, we looked at taxes, Roman taxation and Jewish taxation, so I don't want to go over that and cover old ground again. Just say the temple tax, if you don't remember some of the particulars, along with the so-called second tithe. Along with the so-called second tithe. In other words, he's got 2 financial obligations on his mind in the stages of preparation for travel to Jerusalem at a festival occasion. I mean, you're not going to just say, well, I live in Italy, I think I'll give UPS a call and send my half shekel down there to Jerusalem. No, you'd wait until you're in Jerusalem. There's no other way to get it there. You wait till you're in Jerusalem and you're going to carry your half shekel temple tax along with you. Or carry it in your currency and coinage and have it exchanged to the temple and be charged 12% interest as well. Now, the second tithe is something that I haven't mentioned before. We've covered that temple tax business a lot before. But I haven't mentioned what's the so-called second tithe. So-called because the Bible doesn't call it the second tithe. That's a man-made name. But it's not a Levitical tithe. I mean, you know that they had to tithe the 10th of all of their increase to the Levites. Well, this was something beyond that. So it's the so-called second tithe. Now, this wasn't, and there was a third tithe also. This wasn't money they had to give to anybody, though. It was a different type of situation. We can't, this is Old Testament theology, so I won't give you the references, but there are references in the Pentateuch to this. But it was not to be given to anyone, but by Jewish law, it had to be spent in Jerusalem on necessary goods during your pilgrimage there. So that, in other words, it was to bring more currency, more money, into the capital, important, holy Jewish city, Jerusalem. Now, since very few people had money as we have, I could dig in my pocket and here's some change, or here's some bills in the other pocket. People didn't have money per se in those days, but they had possessions, basically produce or livestock. So in your first stage of preparation, knowing that you've got to come up with a half shekel temple tax, as well as the so-called second tithe, that's another 10th of your income for that year that has to be spent annually, yearly in Jerusalem, then while you're still at home, you would first have to sell produce or livestock and come up with some money in local currency that you could carry with you. You'd have to sell produce and livestock, the basic 2 things that people would have. Now, we have to kind of do some of these things before we take a vacation, don't we? But generally we cash a check or we go to the bank with a withdrawal slip or something like that. We can't just carry, well, I think I'll just carry, some extra tomatoes with me. When I get to that Holiday Inn, I'll tell that clerk, I tell you what, I'll swap you these tomatoes if you'll let me stay in your room overnight. She'll say, well, I'm calling the FBI or somebody on these crazy folk that are around here. No, we've got to turn our whatever it is, labor that we've done or produce that we've produced, we've got to somehow turn that into money to take that with us. And then sometimes still that doesn't work, or it's not enough or something. So just cancel vacation and stay home. But anyway, they would take this money they had with them, and it would be for sacrificial purposes, the other things that they had to purchase in Jerusalem. Now, then, getting ahead of ourselves, but I've still got to discuss this under dues, under this financial area here. Once he's in Jerusalem, let's skip over the trip and get in Jerusalem. Once he's there, he's got two options. He's got money with him now. We'll say something about that money he's been carrying in a moment as well. He's got money with him now. He's got two options. He can either buy animals privately around Jerusalem. And don't you know some unscrupulous people can make a killing in that time of the year? Right, raising the price of cattle just exorbitantly. Or he could change his money at the temple for the allowed Tyrian, that is from Tyre, T-Y-R-E, the Tyrian currency, and purchase his animals, conveniently enough, right underneath the royal colonnade, and be charged 12% interest on the exchange of money. You know how at good times of the year American money will buy more than, a German mark, and other times the German or the Japanese yen will buy more, and during bad times for Canadian money, nobody down here on this side of the border, if they see you try to hand them a Canadian dime or a nickel or a quarter, they'll hand that thing right back to you and say, I want American money. Well, it's the same situation that we have here. I mean, times don't change. History stays basically the same. I don't know that either one of these options would be too good unless you could find a pious Jew.
For the
One of these options would be too good unless you could find a pious Jew, one who would treat you fairly around Jerusalem. But you got to remember, you've got a lot of people who, well, it's just like so many other situations, whose whole year revolves right around this period. That is, if they're unscrupulous at all. They can kind of be raising animals during the year, calves, to have them all right here, conveniently enough, somewhere near in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem, near the temple, and then over an 8-day period here, make all types of money selling them. I mean, people do that all the time right now. Some people, it's during a certain time of the year that they, well, I'll give you one for instance. I know the people down at Nancy's Country Store in Wells, and you talk to them, they're friendly. Nancy, the owner, and her husband, very friendly people. They make almost all of their money during the months of July and August. I was back there in the wintertime talking to them, well, how do you do here? I mean, I don't see them working anywhere else. Obviously, you must make a living there. He said, we make more than double the money during those 2 months than we make during the entire rest of the year. That's 10 months out of the year. You got to be a good financial planner to be able to arrange things. You're going to make a killing during July and August because of all the summer camps and the people like that around here. And then it can be pretty dry for the next 10 months of the year. Well, that's the same situation you have here with people that are unscrupulous, let's say. Now, I'm not saying that they are down in Wells, but these could be. Raising these animals, raising the price of these animals during that time of the year. I mean, if someone came, a month before Passover, you'd sell him an animal at a normal price. Or maybe you wouldn't sell it to him. Maybe you just hold on to it, knowing 4 months from now I can make 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times the money. And let's not kid ourselves if we think, well, now wait a minute, if these were Jews. That's right. That's the whole point. But I mean, well, Jews, these were God's people. That's the whole point. They were Jews. And they knew how to make some money. And Jesus has a lot to say about unscrupulous practices like that in the 4 Gospels. Although I know he's basically talking about the priests and the Levites. Well, there's the other option that they have. If you're not going to buy from a private owner somewhere in the area, then you're forced to purchase your animals right there from one of the relations of the high priest. And they just made a killing, changing your money to Tyrian currency as well as changing your money into the animals that you would need. You've got a corner on the market right there. And it's so convenient. Think if you found, let's say, some nice cattle at a nice price down in Hebron. Then you've got about a 12-mile trip to Jerusalem to bring them up there.
I mean, if it were myself, I'd want to buy them right there in the temple, where I just lead them, a couple of 100 yards, and there's your sacrifice. What if you buy them 10 miles away or 5 miles or even 1 mile? I mean, there's so many more hours involved walking over there, dealing and exchanging, getting the animal and walking back. So the priest had just a unique monopoly, a glorious financial situation here by selling all these animals under the royal colonnade. And remember, Jesus gave them a rather blistering rebuke for doing that. They had another setup on the Mount of Olives. He seems to imply if you're going to sell anywhere, sell somewhere besides where you are here in the temple, because you're making mockery of spiritual things and spiritual matters. And he goes on to say, and it causes the Gentiles to stumble, and how it does, and how it causes people who are not Christians who come in the church and see it like a flea market stumble as well. Amen. And we've taught a little on that. All right, so there are the do's. Then a second thing under preparation, we're still talking about preparation, would be the forming of a caravan. Now, all that I've said, Joseph would be going through. He lives up in Galilee. He's not going to cart his animals down there. He's got a half-shekel temple tax he has to pay. He's soon going to have to start paying that for his son as well, Jesus. And he has a so-called second tithe to pay. All this is going through his mind as he prepares for this verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem. Before you go, you've got to prepare. Then after the dues, I said, you'd come to preparing for your caravan. The next step would be to locate or to arrange a caravan to travel in. Notice verse 44. They, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey. They sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. We don't just have Joseph, Mary, the boy Jesus going down there. We have a caravan of pilgrims going down to Jerusalem, said on 2 occasions here in the 44th verse, under company as well as their kinsfolk and acquaintance. Now, there were probably several reasons that this was done. The chief reason that it was done was because this was to serve as a precaution against highwaymen, what we call in good old English highwaymen. In other words, bandits and robbers. What are they carrying with them? Money. Money, not animals, money. You couldn't, in other words, just break into anyone's house like you can in America today and just find money. Very rarely could you break into a home and find money. There wouldn't be money. You couldn't pull open the top dresser drawer or look behind a picture on the wall and find a safe or something and find Jewish shekels in there. There wouldn't be any money there. There'd be animals outside. So if you're going to do your robbing, you're not going to break into homes. You're going to stop people out on the street. But still, even there, people don't have money with them. When are you going to stop those on the street? When you know these people are traveling to one of these festival seasons, especially Passover. And so, as we know from just common experience, larger numbers can sometimes discourage people like this from attempting robbery. You have a lot of people around and you scare them off. You see, the many hills and ravines of Judea just so happen to make excellent hiding places for robbers. I'll give you verses for this here in a moment. I mean, we have verses in the New Testament for this, that the hills and ravines of Judea made excellent hiding places for robbers who knew the thousands of money-loaded pilgrims who'd be coming by headed for Jerusalem shortly. The classic passage is in Luke chapter 10, verses 30 through 37. Parable of the certain or the Good Samaritan. Now, I have to explain that we really need just verse 30. Luke 10, verse 30, down through verse 37 is the end of the parable. But I'll have to explain a little of the background of this 30th verse. Let me read it first. And Jesus answering said, a certain man went down, and it was literally down, 2,500 feet, a drop in elevation from Jerusalem to Jericho. A man went down, although that's not what Jesus meant by the word down. Jerusalem was a heightened city, spiritually speaking. Anything else was down, even if it happened to be up in elevation. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, wounded him, departed, leaving him half dead. Well, probably there was a fight going on, and they, in the process of stealing his money, he's fighting back. They end up tearing his garments off of him, end up wounding him, and they depart, leaving him half dead, which is good, because at least he's still half alive. If you're half dead, that means you're half alive. Well, I've been on that very road that connects Jericho to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem to Jericho. And it is a winding, treacherous road. It's a road that, if some robbers are coming up on you, it's not really possible to escape. If you're going in one direction, like to Jerusalem, which people would be going in that direction with money with them, it's uphill, 2,500 feet. You're not going to get anywhere running uphill against them. And then back downhill, you generally stumble when you're running down an incline like that. And to the right and to the left, just one little nook and cranny and crevice and cave and hole and cactus plant after another. I mean, it's a barren desert there, but with hills and caves and nooks and crannies and crevices everywhere. In other words, places where these highwaymen, these robbers, could easily conceal themselves. So you're going to need a caravan. If you've got maybe 20 or 30 or 40 people, kinsfolk and acquaintances, that is, the people you're related to, and maybe your neighbors from Nazareth in Galilee, you can all travel together as a band, as a caravan. And Jesus was a part of this, you see, in Luke chapter 2. And you would not, hopefully, be robbed. I'll give you another example of the robber syndrome. Barabbas was a robber, according to John 18 and verse 40. John 18:40, then cried they all again, when Pilate said, whom shall I release, Jesus or another? Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. The last phrase of John 18, John the evangelist commenting, now Barabbas was a robber. You say, well, there are many robbers in Scripture. All right, what's significant about Barabbas being a robber? What's the time context of John 18? It's Passover time. Now, this isn't the same Passover as Luke 2. This is Passover time. Jesus' crucifixion took place at Passover. Barabbas, a robber, he just may have been one of those highwaymen in that fictitious parable that is really true to life in Luke chapter 10. One of those highwaymen between Jerusalem and Jericho. Barabbas was a robber. Remember, there were two thieves on the cross. Two what? Thieves on the cross. Two thieves. Mark 15 and verse 27. Barabbas was released, remember, but we've got some other men around who are thieves. Mark 15:27 tells us that these men were thieves, robbers, in other words. And you might also see Mark 14 and verse 48. So there's one reason that they would travel in a caravan. And then another reason they would travel in a caravan was simply for the joy, the fellowship, and the festivity of it all. I mean, it's generally more fun to travel in company than alone, unless you are a loner. Then it's not any fun to travel with others. Most people like to travel in company. Why? As you go, you can talk. You can look at the scenery. Joseph and Mary and Jesus going alone, well, that would kind of be a boring trip down there. You already know one another, so what's new? There's nothing to talk about. No new thing in each other to discover. But go with kinsfolk. You've been busy working the past few months. You haven't had a lot of time to see them or talk with them. Or go with acquaintances, neighbors around your house. You can learn more about them. So there are probably a couple of reasons, but I would say that the precaution against highwaymen would be the chief one, that they would travel together in a caravan. And before I get off the subject of caravan, you might not have known this, but if you turn over to Mark 10:46, not only did Jesus travel to Jerusalem at Passover as a 12-year-old in a caravan, but the last Passover trip Jesus made, which led to his crucifixion, he also traveled in a caravan. Mark 10:46. I dare say you probably never have noticed this verse before, that here for a second occasion at least, and we don't know about other times, he traveled in a joyful caravan of pilgrims. They came to Jericho, and notice the way by which they're going to Jerusalem. They're coming from across Jordan, Transjordan, Perea Decapolis. They came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people. Now, all commentators believe this is a reference to a Passover caravan, just like we have in Luke 2:44. Because we know where he's going, to Jerusalem, and we know the time of year, Passover. So they came to Jericho, and he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people. And that would only stand to reason because of how treacherous the trip would be, a very short one, but a treacherous one, between Jericho and Jerusalem. All right, if you understand preparation, let's get to the trip itself then. There's the preparation that would be made. In other words, you've got to call your relatives up and say, now, are you going to be ready and what time? And, you know, I don't mean to completely contemporize or localize the situation, but you can certainly get in your mind a picture of a standard American vacation. Or if you're going to do anything with anyone else, you've got to make plans ahead of time. Are you going to be off? And, you know, do you have your animals sold? Do you have your money ready? And, well, let's do it together. Let's don't go alone. That's no fun. Let's go together. That's exactly what they're doing. So the trip, secondly, would normally be taken by foot. I bet you thought it was by plane. No, you would be wrong if you thought that. It was by foot. It's reported that Hillel, the elder, one of those great Jewish teachers, made a foot trip to Jerusalem all the way from Babylon. And it was a part of a sacrament or works religion for him to have made a foot trip from Jerusalem all the way, or from Babylon all the way to Jerusalem. The other means of travel that some people would have available would be travel by donkey. Much easier and much quicker. It doesn't say that they travel by donkey in Luke 2, so we would assume that they didn't, although it's possible there could have been a donkey or two in their midst. We all know how the Christmas scenes always have Mary riding on a donkey and Joseph walking in front of her. But where is that in Scripture, I would ask, that Mary was riding on a donkey and Joseph walking on foot in front of her? That's good popular Christmas lore, but it's probably popular Christmas legend as well. I think Mary went into labor because of that 70-mile walk she took. That's why. I guess a donkey could do it as well, but it was that 70-mile or 60-mile walk that put her in labor. Now, Jesus did later ride into the city on an ass, but that was to fulfill prophecy. And he didn't make the whole trip from Galilee to Jerusalem. He found the animal locally in Jerusalem once he was there, remember, and sent his apostles to bring it to him, and he rode in on that. And later in the New Testament, the government official from Ethiopia rode in on a chariot, but his official status would explain that. In other words, most people would be going by foot. So you've got to picture Mary and Joseph and 14 other Jewish couples and the children that they had, the ones that were making the trip, and you would have quite an occasion on your hands. Quite an occasion. I think it was more was involved in just let's protect ourselves from highwaymen and robbers, but just the festivity of it all. of 14 Jewish couples together, and all or as many of their children as went along with them, you'd have quite a procession on your hands, and all of them walking, and probably running and leaping and scurrying and hiding and playing, and it'd be quite an event. And as we'll see here in a moment, if we've got time to get that far, it was meant to be an occasion for them. It was their vacation. And then thirdly, let's come to their arrival in the city. Finally, their arrival in the city. Now, under normal considerations, finding a place to stay in Jerusalem would be no real problem at all. But the festival season, however, is another issue. That famous Jewish book, the Talmud, says that it was one of the 10 wonders of God that all people found shelter during Passover, and none said to another, I quote, "The crowd is too great, I cannot find shelter in Jerusalem." So the Talmud tells us. It was one of the 10 wonders of God that no one was left out. Well, that's probably a little bit of lore and legend as well. You couldn't stay in the spacious temple courts. That ought to hold an army or two and 35 acres. But that was prohibited by Jewish law. You couldn't stay overnight in the temple courts. There were inns in Jerusalem. We see one mentioned in the rest of that parable in Luke 10. Remember, the Good Samaritan comes along and takes him and puts him in an inn, I-N-N, as in holiday. But the inns would be immediately filled up. First come, first served. Private homes would then be the next resort. Pious Jews would open their homes for pilgrim Jews to stay in. And on occasions like this, I know it's still done down to this day. Whenever last year they had down in New Orleans this great, huge Holy Spirit conference, I know numerous homes in the New Orleans area, Christian homes, were opened up to fellow charismatics who'd be traveling from all over the world to attend this seminar, this charismatic festival, Passover festival, we could say. And there were various places where you could get in contact with, who had the list of the people in this area, the Christians, the charismatic Christians in this area in New Orleans who would open their home for you to stay in. Well, the private homes would also be filled up. Some of the people might be lodging in places as far away as Bethphage or Bethany, in other words, not in Jerusalem. They'd have to find a neighboring or a nearby city or town such as Bethphage or Bethany, which is exactly what Jesus did on his last trip. There was no room in Jerusalem, evidently, and he stayed outside of Jerusalem on the other side of the Mount of Olives, the little town of Bethany. Passages for that would be Mark 11. You put all this together and you'll see that's where he stays. And then he makes a daily trip. It's a short walk, a few miles, but he make a daily trip into Jerusalem in the morning to stay during the day, and he would go home or go back to the place he was staying in Bethany at night. Mark 11, verses 11 to 12, verses 19 to 20, verse 27, and then chapter 14 and verse 3. I'll give you that again. Mark 11, verses 11 to 12, verses 19 to 20, verse 27, and Mark 14, 3. Jewish law, however, said that on the Passover night, the whole feast is really 8 days, remember. 1 day for Passover and 7 for unleavened bread. Jewish law, however, said that on the Passover night itself, you must find a place to stay in Jerusalem. But since this was a mathematically hopeless case You just simply couldn't fit the people in Jerusalem. Then the rabbis, famous for making laws and then making ways to skirt those laws, extended the legal boundaries of Jerusalem just for this one night to cover the nearby cities such as Bethphage and Bethany. Quite scholars they were. They made laws and made ways to skirt those laws. I mean, it's a mathematically impossible situation to house everyone in the confines of the city of Jerusalem. So they would legally, for one night, extend the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem to cover nearby cities. The two most famous ones in the New Testament are Bethphage and Bethany. But even these would not provide the necessary room. Now notice we've gone step by step on where to stay. You ever gone into a town and found it difficult to locate a place to stay? Then you just had only a part of a taste of what it'd be like at Passover time in the first century in Jerusalem. Inns would be closed up. Private homes would go next. They'd be closed up. Well, I think I'll take advantage of this legal loophole devised by the rabbis and stay in a neighboring town or city. Well, those would be quickly filled up. And so, finally, this is the fourth option, we would have thousands of private tents set up in the hills all around Jerusalem. And as you descended on the city at night, it would truly look like Christmas. There would have been lights glowing everywhere. It would have been a beautiful sight to see. Quite a memorable experience. Remember that Jesus is going here as a 12-year-old. So here is what Jesus would have been able to experience as a boy. Now, we're not told where he stayed. He'd have one of these four options. I would say it's just speculation, but it stands to reason that they had that fourth option to follow. They didn't have the others. They were taken up. They stayed in private tents. In other words, you'd carry a small tent along with you. It's not bad weather. The weather's not inclement then, but you need something over your head anyway. It could be cool in the evenings, but something over your head would suffice. And so he would have slept out under a tent with his parents, maybe with some of the other children, on this Passover night. It was a very festive occasion for them. Now let's go back to Luke 2, and let me finish, if I can, commenting along this line. Luke 2. In verse 44, we see that Jesus' family traveled with both relatives and friends. Now, the men and women may have traveled separately, with the women going first. Why do you think that would be? So they can set the slow pace. If you put the men first and let them set the pace, the women and children probably couldn't keep up. If you let the women travel first, the women would set the pace, which would be slower than a male's pace, let's face it. It'd be slower than the men's, and then the men would follow behind. Now, Jesus, being at an in-between age, 12, not a child, but not yet a man, would have found it difficult to know which parent to stay with. So each parent may have assumed that he was with the other. The children beneath the age of 13 or 12 stayed with the mother, and those over that stayed with the father. Whenever they traveled was just the Jewish way to do it. The mother would, and that makes sense, the mother would watch after the smaller ones, and the father the older, the larger ones. But since Jesus is kind of at an in-between age here, each parent may have assumed, well, Mary says, he must be with Joseph. That's why I don't see him around me. And Joseph's saying, well, he must be with Mary, and that's why I don't see him. Have you ever had that happen, wives, husbands, with your children? Well, I just assumed he was, well, I assumed that he, well, where is he now? That's exactly what they're experiencing here. They didn't bother to check until pitching camp the first night out of the city. They go a whole day's journey, just assuming that he's with the other parent. They don't check until they pitch camp that night. All of this is in our account that we just read. When he wasn't located, then Joseph and Mary turned back to Jerusalem evidently without the company of the caravan. And after a day out, a day away from Jerusalem, they finally find out that he's not with them that night. A day back, 1 day's journey back to Jerusalem. Then they had to find another place to spend the night. And then the next morning, they finally locate him in the temple. Notice verse 46. It came to pass after 3 days. How do we get those 3 days? A day out of the city, a day back, and then the next morning, 3 days, they found him. Now, let me just end with this note on what an expensive but festive time it was for the Jews. It was very expensive for them. Maybe this is why you never hear of the Jews ever taking a vacation. This was their vacation. They had to have money in Jerusalem, the so-called second tithe. You had to spend that in Jerusalem to provide for the Passover. For Passover, you had to have a lamb, 4 cups of wine, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and free will offerings. Then you had all the expense of feeding and lodging your company, your family, for half of a month. The trip down, the stay there, and the trip back would be rather expensive. You may want to see Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 26. Deuteronomy 14:26. Thou shalt bestow that money. Here's the verse for the second tithe. For whatsoever thy soul desireth, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household. There's the text for the second tithe, Deuteronomy 14:26. Philo gives a description of this experience as one of great enjoyment and festivity for the Jews. Josephus writes, they feasted 7 whole days and spared no expense. Your whole year really revolved around this. Here they could buy wild game, such as gazelle and other forms of meat. They could buy fish and oil, olives, grapes, walnuts, leeks, vetches, and honey to sweeten the wine. The children were given little rusks and nuts as tidbits to keep them quiet on the trip. The smallest children, however, were left at home. You did not start taking the children until they were of age. Evidently, this was Jesus' first trip to the temple. Why go at the age of 12? At 12, a boy went for preparation. And at age 13, he went for the real thing that Jews call today a bar mitzvah. Now, the bar mitzvah today has little in comparison with the bar mitzvah of the 1st century A.D. But then a boy went and he was of age.